Hey, friends. I just want to welcome you to Just Talking About Jesus today. Before we get started, the reason why I ask for you to subscribe to this channel is because, first of all, it's easier for you to be able to get notifications for when the new episodes arrive. So if you're interested in that, look down below and do a little subscribe for me. Also, I realized when I got ready to edit this episode that something went wrong with the first half. So we're going to jump right into the second half. I do have all the information from what her episode had been about with the missing part, and that's all in the show notes. You'll be able to find those there. It's listed under my newsletter, which is a Substack newsletter. So if you hit the subscribe on that, or you can just link to that one specifically if you'd like to know the rest of the story. So my apologies, and I hope you enjoy this. So you've been collecting stories. Tell me about that.
Well, I guess it would start, I had always dreamed and always knew that I was going to write a book. And I would just every year I would go on my birthday, which I just celebrated my birthday, and I just turned 55 on January 8th. But every year I would go to the beach. I would go to the water and ask God, is it time for me to write my story? And every year it was no. Every year I knew that it was no. And I've been doing this since I was about 28 years old. And every year was like, no, not yet, not yet. And then 2 years ago, I actually moved from Buffalo, New York to the Golden Isles of Georgia. And so my whole life happened in New York, but yet God brought me to the Golden Isles, to Jekyll Island, for me to write my story. And on my birthday of 2 years ago, I said, God, is it time? And I just felt like, wow, okay, something's different. And I came home and I saw my rag doll sitting on my headboard in my guest bedroom. I'm like, oh my goodness, that's my book. And when I was like 6 or 7 years old, for Christmas, every year my mother would give my sister and I a doll. And when I was 6 or 7 years old, my mother gave me a rag doll. And I named her Josephine Priscilla after a movie that I had saw that was called The Orphan Train. And it was all these little kids in New York City that went onto the train and they were sent out west. Well, one of the little girls on there, she was a newspaper boy, but she was really a girl, but she had to dress up and her name was Josephine Priscilla. And so I named my doll Josephine Priscilla. And that day, 2 years ago, when I got back from the beach, I began to start writing my story. I wrote my story and it took me 3.5 weeks to write it because it took me 52 years to live it, because I knew that it was there and I knew that it was time. Every night I would share what I wrote to one of my dear friends, and she was an editor, but she said, Bambi, I can't edit this book. There's no way. I don't want to edit your voice out of it. And so I had to find a different editor. I didn't understand the whole process of all this editing and what it cost. I had no idea. I just knew that God had given me my story and for me to write my story. When I finally, when my book finally was published and it came out, and it came to my door, for the first time, that was such an exciting, exhilarating thing that, oh my goodness, your book is in your hand. And I spent that evening reading my book, and I spent the whole night just reading, crying, spending the time of what God was doing healing in my life, that he was rejuvenating me. He was taking all the pain of my life and he was just renewing me. It was like an onion that was peeling piece by piece. And when I closed that book, I'm like, God, I'm not that same person anymore. I'm not her anymore. And I realized at that moment that I didn't write my story for me. I wrote my story so that other people could be brave enough to write theirs. I realized that my story was for me to go on this journey to find these women that needed bravery, that needed courage, and they needed somebody to be vulnerable enough to tell her story so that they can tell theirs.
Yeah.
So I have been on a journey of finding people, and not even me finding people, but God finding these people, finding these opportunities for me to be able to share my story, for people to read my story. I did win an award on my cover and on my writing, which is so amazing because I'm not a writer. But when I was in 7th grade, I had an English teacher that called me into her office, and she said, "You are going to write someday and you're going to represent the school because you have a gift of writing."
Mm.
And I didn't understand stuff like that except, in 7th grade, it was a young girl. We didn't talk that way. Our parents didn't talk that way to us, kind of thing. But I remembered when my book came out and I won an award on the cover, and I won a silver on my writing.
Yeah.
That was like the most amazing thing ever, to have somebody believe in how I wrote.
And
But
now you have a new identity because you are
I
a writer.
I know, I'm a published author. So I do have 2 books out. The Journey of Josephine is my first one, and The Treasures of My Heart is my second one. But God took me on this path to meet people and to hear other people's stories, and to realize I thought for my whole life that I lived inside of a globe, like the globe that you shake, thinking that I'm the only one that's going through this and I'm watching the world pass by me. But as people picked up my book and read my book, they would contact me and they would say, "This happened to me. Thank you for sharing your story, because now I'm brave enough to share mine." I remember sharing my story with a single woman that lived in, a tough time, a tough part of town. She was a Black woman. She began to tell me that in their culture, you don't share, things about your life. You don't share the stories within inside of your home. And so we began to talk, and I gave her a copy of my book. And the next day, she called me and she said, "Oh my goodness, you told my story. You told my story, and we're not even the same culture, and we're not even the same color, and you told my story." She was, "Your story spoke to my soul, that I could feel some healing that was taking place in my own life."
Mhm.
I believe that the more that we tell our stories, the more that we're not different than each other. We all have scars.
Mhm.
We all have things that have taken our lives, but it's what you do with it. There are thousands and thousands and thousands of women that were little girls that were molested by family members. There are thousands and thousands of thousands of girls that were raised in alcoholic homes, that had been sexually assaulted, that lived in poverty, that were victims of domestic violence, that were victims of infidelity. My story is no different than some people. The difference is that I have allowed God to mold me and to transform me. I've allowed him to put me on the potter's wheel and say, "We got to get rid of this, Bambi. We're going to need to get rid of this." I've allowed him to take the ashes of my life and turn them into beauty. I've allowed him to take every part and every nook and cranny of my life and transform it, and to do a metamorphosis, of it. I tell the story all the time about the whole process, even of the oyster and the pearl. That oyster has no pearl in it until it's gone through some stuff. That oyster, it stands alone without that pearl until the parasites and the sand and the hurricane and the winds and the distress of life. Then when you look and inside of that pearl, after they've gone through all of that, the oyster, you open up the oyster and you see this beautiful pearl. And sometimes that pearl is small, and sometimes that pearl is really big, because it's about the condition of what that oyster has gone through. That's our own life. That's our life. And what my book and what my story has been able to do, it's brought me to the door. But the lessons that I have learned through the heartache of life has brought me inside the door. Because there's a time that people don't, you have a time that people want to hear your story, but then there's a time that people are like, "Okay, we've heard it enough. So what are you going to do with that?
Yeah.
How many excuses are you going to make from your behavior because you've been through something?" It comes to a point that the elephant in the room no longer is the person that violated you. The elephant in the room no longer is the person that you were a victim of domestic violence. No longer is the elephant in the room have to do with what you've been through. Now the elephant in the room is the reflection of yourself, of why you chose this, what happened, what are you going to do, with these situations? How are you going to use these to heal? I can't blame anymore. I'm not angry anymore for what people have done to me. I'm not angry anymore for the life that I have lived. I'm not angry anymore that I had to go through this. I'm more hurt. I was more hurt now that you did that to me. And I no longer blame them I don't put blame on it anymore. And it's not my fault. I don't have to carry it anymore. And I think that that's what victims have to realize. You come to a point that it doesn't matter. You could have worn anything you wanted to wear. You could have done whatever you wanted to do. You could have, my ex-husband I was a victim of domestic violence. It's not about that I didn't pray long enough. It's not about that I didn't sacrifice. It wasn't that I needed to be silent anymore. You chose to do something to me that you had no right to do.
Right.
And so you begin to start saying, it's not my fault anymore, but you take accountability for your healing.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what my book did. My book began to start having women take accountability, for what they have been through. And the more that we tell our stories, the more set free we become, and the more that we become a tribe and realize that we're all no different than each other.
And I think we have to allow God to make us into a new creature,
Absolutely.
And I mean, he's standing right there waiting to do that for us. But we have to say, yes, I want you to make me anew. Show me how to do that. Show
Yeah.
me how to go about that.
And it's hard. And, the Bible's really clear about 7 times your fall. It's not the falling that matters. It's the getting back up that matters. It's not the pit that you have been placed in and that you have to crawl, it's us crawling ourselves out of it and grabbing hold of his hand.
Mm-hmm.
That's what it's about. It's about grabbing hold of his hand and hanging on for dear life. It's not about the woman with the issue of blood that she spent 12 years with this issue and people have taken her money. She was in hiding. She couldn't go out because, she had a menstrual cycle. It wasn't about those 12 years, but it was about that moment that she was brave enough to go out and to grab the hem of his garment.
Yeah.
That's what it's about. That's what God wants. He's showing us, grab my hem, sit at the foot of the cross, renew your mind of how you think I look at you and believe in how I do look at you.
Yeah.
He wants us just to surrender it all and just say, God, I surrender all to you. I surrender. And it's not about what we go through. It had nothing to do with the woman with the issue of blood, of what she went through, but it was that moment in time that she grabbed his hem.
Yeah.
And that's what the story is. That's what the story that God wants us to remember is the grabbing hold of the hem of his garment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. He's a good daddy, isn't he?
He sure is. He sure is. He sure is.
Where can people find you?
You can find me, on all kind of social media platforms under Bambi Lynn. I am on TikTok, that it is Healing Through Stories, and then in parentheses is my name. You also can go on my website, healingthroughstories.com. And I do have, I am running that if anybody signs up and anybody, subscribes to my website, there is a pop-up for a 10% discount, with a code, if you want to purchase my books or my t-shirts. Most authors, I'm no different than anybody else, would rather you come to my website, would rather you, purchase from my website. And then you get a personal, author sign, from me, to do that. I also blog weekly, so that is something I love people to subscribe. And I have been on over 120, different podcasts that people can look me up even on YouTube, that if they wanted to hear more of my story, you do that. And I am now looking for speaking engagements, for my story, to be able to present my story, out into the world on a platform. So if you know anybody, that's looking for a speaker and looking for somebody with motivation, Christ-like motivation and inspiring, I am also available, and you can go on my website and send me an email.
That's awesome. That's yeah, so much that people will be able to relate to, just because even if you're raised in a healthy home environment, that doesn't mean your whole life was filled with that. There's other twists and turns of things and trying to figure out who you are and whatever. But a lot of people
Absolutely. I
be
tell
really,
this story and we can end after I tell the story. When I turned 49, one of my friends said, Bambi, you have to do something special before you turn 50. How about get a tattoo? And I'm like, no, I'm not getting a tattoo. And I had just read a book called The 5 Second Rule. It was by Mel Robbins. She was a motivational speaker. And she just tells you that your brain when it goes to 6 seconds, it immediately starts fearing and it immediately gives you all of these aspects of why you're not going to do something. So I decided, my girlfriend said, why don't you go skydiving? And I'm like, okay, sure, I'll go skydiving, because I just read this book and I'm going to put it to practice. So I had an opportunity with one of my daughters to go skydiving, and here, they suit you all up, you're all in harness, to protect you. And I had these words written on my hand that said, live no doubt. And I was a little cocky. I was a little like, I'm a mother of 6. I have these grandchildren. I'm like a little cocky. We go up into the plane at 17,000 feet. I'm the first person that is coming out that is going to have to jump out of this plane. The guy says to me, get to the end of the plane, get really close to the edge of the plane. They do not count because they know that somebody's going to take their hands and like push them out and you're not going to get me out. So they tell you to sit at the edge of it. And as you're sitting in the edge of it, you're just waiting for that push. And finally that push came and I went out it starts from 7 minutes. It takes about 7 minutes for you to get from top to bottom. And I was screaming, I was yelling, I vomited, I dropped gum in my mouth, like I was like, he goes, isn't this fun? And I'm like, no, my cheeks are flopping in the wind and stuff like that. And he tells me, he said, when we get to the bottom, don't land on your feet and don't land on your knees. You have to land on your butt. So I'm like, oh my goodness. So I'm trying to like figure out how I'm going to land. I landed on my butt. He says to me when we land, and I'm feeling like morning sickness had just like hit me. And he says to me, would you ever do this again? And I don't mean to yell, to swear at your audience, but I said, hell no. No way. That's life. That is how life is. That's like, so if anybody wants to know what is life about, go skydiving, because that will teach you what life is all about, that you're as cocky as all get out because you're little girls and we played, how to have house. We played how our husband's going to be for our whole lives. We knew what our children are going to be like. And then we get into life and we get thrown out. And we land on our butts continually because that's the definition of life.
Yeah, in a nutshell. Oh, that sounds just terrifying to me.
Well, life is terrifying, isn't it?
Sometimes it can be terrifying. That is absolutely true.
So I figured I'd leave that with your guest. That's just life. And sometimes you're going to land on your butt, but you're going to have to get back up.
But we also have Jesus right beside us the whole way through, whether we see him or recognize him or not, right?
Absolutely.
Right?
And he wants you to fall because he's going to pick you up.
Exactly.
So that's the moral of the story. Yeah, you're going to fall, but he is going to pick you back up.
Absolutely. Thank you, Bambi.
Thank you so much for having me on finally.
I know.
And thank you, so much to your listeners. And if they, ever want to reach out to me, please don't hesitate, to reach out.
Yeah. God's timing.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
You bet.